30 minutes. That's all it took for Marcus Holloway to go from a husband walking through his own front door to a dead man lying in a pool of his own blood. 30 minutes between discovering his pregnant wife in bed with his best friend and taking his last breath. But here's what they don't tell you about betrayal. It doesn't happen in 30 minutes. It happens slowly, deliberately, right under your nose while you're out working double shifts, providing for a family that's already plotting your end. This is the story of a good man who trusted the wrong people, and how that trust became his death sentence. Atlanta, Georgia. Summer of 2019. The kind of neighborhood where front porches stay lit until midnight, where church on Sunday isn't optional, and where everybody knows your business before you do. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and the smell of somebody's mama's cooking drifting through screen doors. This was Marcus Holloway's world. 34 years old, respected electrician, deacon at Greater Faith Baptist Church, the kind of black man the community pointed to and said, "That's how you do it right." Marcus wasn't flashy. Didn't need to be. He drove a reliable truck, paid his bills on time, and came home every night to a wife he adored and a baby on the way. 5 months pregnant, and Marcus couldn't stop talking about it. Couldn't stop planning. He'd already painted the nursery twice. Once in yellow, then again in a soft green because Tasha said the yellow was too bright. He didn't argue. Never did. That's just who Marcus was. The peacekeeper. The provider. The man who believed that if you did right by people, they'd do right by you. But belief doesn't stop a bullet. Every morning started the same way for Marcus. Up at 5:30, coffee black and strong, work boots laced tight. He'd kiss Tasha's forehead while she pretended to sleep, whisper a prayer over her belly, and head out into the Atlanta heat to wire houses, fix breakers, keep the lights on for families just like his. Some days he worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes 14. The baby wasn't cheap, and neither was the life he wanted to give his family. So Marcus worked, and worked, and worked. He'd come home exhausted, smelling like sweat and copper wire, and Tasha would be on the couch scrolling through her phone. Used to be she'd meet him at the door. Used to be she'd have dinner waiting, or at least a smile. But lately things felt different. Distant. When he'd reach for her hand, she'd pull away. When he'd try to talk about the baby, she'd change the subject. "It's the hormones," she'd say, waving him off. "Pregnancy makes you weird. You wouldn't understand." And Marcus, being Marcus, believed her. Because that's what you do when you love someone. You believe them. Even when everything inside you is screaming that something's wrong. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday night in July. Marcus came home around 8, earlier than usual because a job got canceled. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He called out for Tasha, heard movement upstairs, then her voice slightly panicked, telling him she'd be right down. When she appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair was messy, her shirt inside out. "I was napping," she said, but her eyes wouldn't meet his. And there was something else. A smell. Not hers. Cologne. Male. Expensive. "You got company?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice light. "What? No. Why would you?" She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You're being paranoid, Marcus. I told you I was sleeping." He wanted to push. Wanted to walk up those stairs and check every room. But he didn't. Because Marcus Holloway wasn't that kind of man. He wasn't the jealous type, the insecure type, the type who went through his wife's phone or interrogated her about every minute of her day. So he let it go. Swallowed the doubt. Told himself he was overreacting. But the cologne lingered. Even after Tasha came downstairs and kissed his cheek and asked about his day like everything was normal, Marcus could still smell it. And it smelled familiar. The phone calls started next. Tasha's cell would ring, and she'd glance at the screen, then walk into another room to answer. "It's just my sister," she'd say. Or, "It's the doctor's office." But Marcus could hear her voice through the walls, softer, more animated, the way she used to sound when they first started dating. The way she didn't sound with him anymore. Then there were the late nights. Tasha had never been a night owl, but suddenly she was staying up past midnight, phone glowing in the dark, her thumbs flying across the screen. When Marcus would stir and ask who she was texting, she'd lock the phone immediately. Nobody. Just scrolling. Go back to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy anymore. Not for Marcus. He'd lie there in the dark, listening to Tasha's breathing, feeling the space between them grow wider, even though they were in the same bed. He'd think about the cologne, the phone calls, the distance, and he'd tell himself he was being crazy. That pregnancy was hard on women. That he needed to be more understanding, more patient, more present. Except how could he be more present when he was working 16-hour days to afford the life she said she wanted? The irony wasn't lost on him. Deshaun Parker had been Marcus's best friend since they were 14 years old. They met in 9th grade, bonded over basketball and hip-hop and being two black kids trying to figure out how to survive in a world that didn't always want them to. They went to prom in a shared limo, graduated high school together. When Marcus's father died, Deshaun was the one who sat with him through the night, didn't say a word, just stayed. And when Marcus met Tasha at a 4th of July cookout 5 years ago, Deshaun was right there, hyping him up, telling him to shoot his shot. Deshaun was his best man. Marcus was his. They were brothers. Not by blood, but by choice. The kind of friendship people write songs about. So when Deshaun started coming around more often, Marcus didn't think twice about it. Deshaun had always been part of the family. He'd show up with groceries, help fix things around the house, crack jokes that made Tasha laugh in a way Marcus hadn't heard in months. "Man, you're working too much," Deshaun would say, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Let me help out." That's what brothers do. And Marcus was grateful. Relieved even. Because the truth was he was drowning. Between the job and the baby preparations and Tasha's mood swings, he needed help. So when Deshaun offered to check on Tasha while Marcus pulled doubles, it felt like a blessing. It never occurred to him that blessings could be disguises. Deshaun was everything Marcus wasn't. Flashy. Charismatic. Always had money, though nobody quite knew where it came from. He drove a Range Rover, wore designer clothes, flashed a gold watch that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. Women loved Deshaun. Always had. He had that smile, that charm, that way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. Tasha used to joke about it. "Your boy's fine," she'd say, laughing. "If I wasn't married to you, I'd be in trouble." Marcus would laugh too, because it was a joke, right? But jokes have a way of becoming truth when nobody's paying attention. It was Marcus's mother, Dorothy, who first put words to what he was feeling. She'd invited him over for Sunday dinner, noticed how tired he looked, how distracted. "What's going on with you, baby?" she asked, passing him a plate of greens and cornbread. "Nothing, Mama. Just work." "And Tasha's been, I don't know, different." Dorothy set down her fork and looked at her son with eyes that had seen too much, lived too long to be fooled. "Different how?" "Distant. Cold. Like she's somewhere else even when she's right in front of me." His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the words that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his very short life. "Baby, a man who smiles in your face can stab you in the back. And sometimes the people closest to you are the ones holding the knife." Marcus wanted to dismiss it. His mother was old school, suspicious of everyone. But the words stuck. They rattled around in his head during every late-night phone call, every time Deshaun showed up unannounced, every time Tasha pulled away from his touch. A man who smiles in your face can stab you in the back. The signs were everywhere, he just didn't want to see them. Like the time he came home and found Tasha wearing makeup. Full face, lashes, the works. Even though she claimed she'd been home all day. Or the fresh flowers on the kitchen table that he didn't buy. Or the way she and Deshaun would exchange glances when they thought he wasn't looking, loaded glances, secret glances, the kind that carry entire conversations without words. But Marcus pushed it down. Told himself he was paranoid. Told himself his mother was projecting her own failed marriage onto his. Told himself that Tasha loved him, that Deshaun was his brother, that people he'd known for years, people he'd built his life around, wouldn't betray him like that. He told himself a lot of things. All of them were lies. Friday, August 16th. The day everything ended. Marcus had been scheduled to work until 6, running electrical for a new construction site in Buckhead. It was hot, miserable work, and he was looking forward to getting home, taking a cold shower, maybe convincing Tasha to let him feel the baby kick. Around 3 o'clock, his foreman told him they were shutting down early, some permit issue with the city. Marcus didn't complain. He packed up his tools, wiped the sweat from his face, and headed to his truck. He was halfway home when he remembered. His lunchbox. He'd left it in the kitchen that morning in his rush to get out the door. Tasha hated when he left things lying around, said it made the house look messy. He'd catch hell if he came home without it. So he turned around, drove the 15 minutes back, and pulled into his driveway at 3:45. The house looked normal. Tasha's car was there. Nothing seemed out of place. Marcus grabbed his keys, walked up to the front door, turned the knob. It was unlocked. That should have been the first sign. Tasha always locked the door, even when she was home. Said it made her feel safer. But today the door was open. Marcus stepped inside, called out, "Baby, I'm home." No answer. He walked through the living room, grabbed his lunchbox from the kitchen counter, was about to turn and leave when he heard it. Laughter. Upstairs. A woman's laughter. Tasha's laughter. But not the polite, distant laugh she'd been giving him for months. This was different. Intimate. Real. The kind of laugh that comes from joy, from pleasure, from being completely comfortable with someone. And then a man's voice. Deep. Familiar. "Come here, girl." Marcus's heart stopped. His feet moved before his brain could catch up. He walked to the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hands were shaking. His chest was tight. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave, to pretend he hadn't heard anything. But he couldn't. He had to know. The bedroom door was cracked open. Light spilled into the hallway. Marcus reached out, pushed it wider, and saw his entire life end. Tasha, his wife, 5 months pregnant with what he thought was his child. Naked. In their bed. The bed where they'd made love, where they'd whispered dreams about their future, where he'd held her through nightmares and morning sickness and every hard moment of this pregnancy. And Deshaun, his best friend, his brother, the man he'd trusted with his life, his home, his family. Tangled together. Skin on skin. Her hands in his hair. His mouth on her neck. For one impossibly long second, nobody moved. Tasha's eyes met Marcus's. Her face went white. She screamed, scrambled to cover herself. Deshaun's head snapped around, saw Marcus standing there, and froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Marcus didn't yell. Didn't curse. Didn't rush forward with fists flying like you might expect. He just stood there. Silent. Still. His face completely blank. And somehow that was worse than rage. Because rage is predictable. Rage is human. But this was something else. This was a man watching his soul leave his body in real time. "Marcus," Tasha's voice cracked. "Marcus, baby, I can explain." But he didn't wait for the explanation. Didn't ask questions. Didn't demand answers. He just turned around and walked away. Down the stairs. Through the living room. Out the front door. Got in his truck. And drove. Behind him, Tasha was crying, screaming his name. Deshaun was throwing on his clothes, yelling something Marcus couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. But none of it mattered anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. Marcus Holloway drove away from his house at 3:52 p.m. By 4:23 p.m., he was dead. Here's what the neighbors heard. A car pulling up fast, tires screeching. Raised voices. 2 men arguing, then a woman screaming. A door slamming. Then silence. Then a single gunshot that shattered the summer evening like glass. Here's what the police found. Marcus Holloway, 34 years old, face down in his own living room, a bullet hole in his chest, blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the carpet he'd vacuumed just last Sunday. His eyes were still open. They say that happens sometimes when death comes quick. The body doesn't have time to understand it's over. Here's what Tasha told them. He came back with a gun. He was going to kill us. I had to protect myself. I had to protect my baby. Here's what Deshawn told them. Man just snapped. I tried to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. It all happened so fast. Here's what they didn't tell them. That 30 minutes earlier, Marcus had caught them in the act. That he'd walked away without violence, without threats, without rage. That the man they were describing, unhinged, dangerous, out of control, wasn't Marcus at all. But dead men can't defend themselves. Dead men can't tell their side of the story. And the living will say whatever they need to say to survive. The question is, what really happened in those 30 minutes? Between the moment Marcus walked out of that house and the moment a bullet stopped his heart, what took place? Did Marcus really come back armed and enraged? Did he really threaten the two people who'd just destroyed his world? Or was there something else at play? Something darker. Something planned. Because here's the thing about betrayal. It rarely happens in isolation. It's not one moment. It's 1,000 small decisions, a series of calculated moves, a pattern of deception that only becomes clear when you look back at the full picture. And when you look back at Marcus Holloway's last days, at the signs he missed and the warnings he ignored, you start to wonder, was his death really a crime of passion, or was it something far more sinister? Marcus's mother would later say she knew. That morning, when Marcus called her on his way to work, something in his voice sounded different. I love you, Mama, he'd said. No matter what happens, you remember that, okay? She'd laughed it off, told him to stop being dramatic. But now those words felt like a premonition. Like somehow, someway, Marcus knew he was running out of time. The community was in shock. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon that Sunday about trust and betrayal, about how the people closest to us can sometimes cause the deepest wounds. The church was packed. Everyone wanted to understand how something like this could happen. How a good man, a God-fearing man, a man who'd never hurt anyone, could end up dead in his own home. But grief has a way of blinding us to the truth. And the truth was beginning to surface slowly, methodically, like a body rising from deep water. Because while Tasha was crying at the funeral, playing the devastated widow, while Deshawn was standing in the back wearing dark sunglasses and Marcus's gold watch, Detective Lisa Monroe was already asking questions. Questions about fingerprints and gunshot residue. Questions about phone records and bank statements. Questions that, once answered, would reveal that Marcus Holloway's murder wasn't random at all. It was orchestrated. So before we go any further, before we dive into the investigation that would expose one of the most calculated betrayals in Atlanta's recent history, I need you to ask yourself something. How well do you really know the people you trust? Your spouse, your best friend, the people you'd take a bullet for. Do you really know what they're capable of when their back is against the wall? When desire and desperation collide? When the life they want requires you to not be in it? Marcus Holloway thought he knew. And that misplaced trust cost him everything. If this story has you questioning everything you thought you knew about loyalty and betrayal, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you think really happened in those 30 minutes. Did Marcus come back for revenge, or did Tasha and Deshawn set a trap? And if you're not already subscribed to True Crime Dossier, what are you waiting for? This is just the beginning of the story. The investigation is about to blow this case wide open, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's uncover the truth together. Because Marcus Holloway deserves justice. And the only way he gets it is if we keep digging. Blood doesn't wash off as easily as you think. Ask Tasha Holloway. When the police arrived at her home on that August evening, she was still wearing it, Marcus's blood, streaked across her arms, staining her clothes, pooled in the creases of her palms. She was shaking, sobbing, screaming words that didn't quite make sense. But here's what you need to understand about liars. They always give you just enough truth to make the lie believable. And Tasha? She was about to tell the performance of her lifetime. 4:27 p.m. That's when the 911 call came through. A woman's voice, high-pitched and panicked. He's dead, oh God, he's dead. I didn't have a choice. He was going to kill us. Please send help, please. The dispatcher tried to calm her down, tried to get a coherent story, but all Tasha kept saying was, "I had to do it. I had to protect my baby." By 4:35, 3 patrol cars and an ambulance were screaming down Maple Grove Avenue. Neighbors poured out of their houses, drawn by the sirens and the spectacle. This was the kind of neighborhood where crime didn't happen, where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. A shooting? A murder? This was the kind of thing that happened somewhere else, to someone else. Not to Marcus Holloway. Not to the man everyone loved. The first officer through the door was Sergeant Davis, a 20-year veteran who'd seen his share of domestic violence calls. He walked into that living room expecting to see what he'd seen 100 times before. A husband who pushed too hard, a wife who finally pushed back, a tragedy born from years of hidden abuse. But what he saw instead stopped him cold. Marcus Holloway was lying face down on the hardwood floor, one arm stretched out like he'd been reaching for something, or someone. The entry wound was clean, centered in his chest. Professional, almost. One shot, one kill. No signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken lamps, nothing to suggest the kind of chaos that comes with a fight for your life. Just Marcus, dead, and a gun on the coffee table still warm from being fired. And Tasha, sitting on the couch, rocking back and forth, covered in blood that wasn't hers, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Deshaun was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. When Sergeant Davis asked him what happened, Deshaun's voice came out flat, rehearsed, like he'd been practicing the words. "Man just lost it. Came back here raging, talking about how we betrayed him, how we had to pay. He had a gun. Tasha grabbed it first. She saved our lives. Simple. Clean. Self-defense. Except nothing about this scene was simple. Detective Lisa Monroe arrived at 5:15. 38 years old, 15 years on the force, and a reputation for seeing through bullshit that had earned her both respect and enemies in the department. She wasn't the warm, sympathetic type. Didn't do hand-holding or soft voices. When she walked into that house and saw Marcus's body, saw Tasha's tears, saw Deshaun's carefully constructed calm, every instinct she'd honed over a decade and a half started screaming. Something was wrong. She pulled Sergeant Davis aside. "Walk me through it. Domestic situation. Husband caught the wife cheating with the best friend. Came back for revenge. Wife shot him in self-defense. Open and shut." "Yeah." Monroe looked back at the body. "Then why is he face down?" Davis frowned. "What? If Marcus came at them with a gun, if there was a struggle, why is he face down? People shot from the front fall backward, not forward. And where are the defensive wounds? If he was the aggressor, they should have bruises, scratches, something." She walked over to the coffee table, studied the gun without touching it. "This weapon's been wiped clean except for one set of prints. You process it yet?" "Still waiting on forensics." Monroe nodded slowly. "Get me phone records. Both of them. And I want to know every financial transaction in the last 6 months. Something about this doesn't fit." But officially, publicly, the story was already set. Tasha Holloway, 29 years old and 5 months pregnant, had shot her husband in self-defense after he returned home in a jealous rage. It was tragic. Understandable. The kind of story that made people shake their heads and say, "What a shame," before moving on with their lives. The community didn't move on. Greater Faith Baptist Church was packed that Sunday. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, his voice heavy with grief, and tried to make sense of the senseless. Marcus Holloway was a good man, he said. A faithful man. A man who loved his family, his community, his God. And now he's gone. Taken from us in an act of violence that none of us can fully comprehend. In the third row, Tasha sat with her hands folded over her belly, dressed in black, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses. Women from the congregation kept coming up to her, hugging her, whispering condolences, telling her it wasn't her fault, which she did what she had to do. And Tasha would nod, dab at her eyes with a tissue, and play the role of the grieving widow with such conviction you'd almost believe it. Almost. In the back of the church, Deshaun Parker stood alone, wearing sunglasses even though they were indoors, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't sit, didn't sing, didn't pray, just stood there like a man waiting for permission to leave. When the service ended and people started filing out, several men from the congregation gave him hard looks. One of them, Marcus's cousin Jerome, walked right up to him and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You got some nerve showing up here." Deshaun didn't respond, just turned and walked out. But here's the thing nobody noticed in that moment. Deshaun was wearing Marcus's watch. The silver Movado with the black face that Marcus had saved up 6 months to buy. The watch he never took off. The watch that was supposed to be on his wrist when they buried him. Dorothy Holloway noticed. Marcus's mother saw everything. She sat in the front row during the service, dry-eyed and silent, while everyone around her wept. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, she stood up, walked to the front, and looked out at the congregation with eyes that burned. "My son," she said, her voice steady and cold, "was not a violent man. Never raised his hand to anyone in his life. Never owned a gun, never talked about guns, never wanted anything to do with guns. So when people tell me he came home armed and dangerous, ready to kill, I know they're lying. I know my son, and I know something's wrong with this story." She turned and looked directly at Tasha. "The truth always comes out. Always. And when it does, everyone who had a hand in this will answer for it." The church went silent. Tasha's face went pale. Deshaun had already left. 3 days after the funeral, Detective Monroe sat in her office surrounded by file folders, crime scene photos, and a growing list of inconsistencies that wouldn't let her sleep. The forensics report had come back. The gun, a 9mm Glock, had only one set of fingerprints on it. Tasha's. Not Marcus's. Not Deshaun's. Just Tasha's. Monroe stared at that report for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the medical examiner. "Tell me about the gunshot residue." The ME's voice crackled through the line. Tasha Holloway tested positive for GSR on her right hand, consistent with firing a weapon. Deshaun Parker tested negative. Marcus Holloway also tested negative. Wait, say that again. Marcus tested negative. Correct. No gunshot residue on his hands. Meaning he didn't fire a weapon. And if someone's threatening you with a gun, if there's a struggle, you'd expect to find residue on them, right? Generally, yes. Especially if the gun discharged in close proximity. Monroe hung up and leaned back in her chair. Marcus didn't fire a gun. Marcus didn't even touch the gun. So how exactly was he the aggressor in this scenario? She opened Tasha's phone records next, scanning through weeks of calls and texts. Most of it was mundane. Calls to her sister, texts to friends, nothing suspicious. Until she got to the day of the murder. At 1:47 p.m., 2 hours before Marcus came home, Tasha sent a text message. Not to her sister. Not to a friend. To Deshaun. For words. "He'll be home early." Monroe read it again. And again. Then she grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Deshaun Parker lived in a modern apartment complex on the east side of Atlanta. The kind of place with a doorman and a gym and rent that cost more than most people's mortgages. When Monroe showed up with a warrant to search his phone, Deshaun tried to play it cool, tried to act like he had nothing to hide. But his hands were shaking when he handed over his cell. Monroe scrolled through his messages. Found the text from Tasha. "He'll be home early." And Deshaun's response, sent 3 minutes later. "Be ready." Be ready for what? Monroe looked up at Deshaun. "Want to explain this?" "Explain what?" "We were just talking." "Talking about what specifically?" "What were you supposed to be ready for?" Deshaun's jaw tightened. "I don't remember. It was just a text. Just a text sent 2 hours before your best friend ended up dead. Just a text that suggests you knew Marcus was coming home early, that you were expecting him, that you were preparing for something. So I'll ask again, what were you getting ready for, Deshaun?" "I want a lawyer." And just like that, the official story started to crumble. Because here's what "he'll be home early, be ready" tells you. This wasn't a surprise. This wasn't Marcus walking in on an affair and snapping. This was planned, anticipated, expected. Tasha knew Marcus was coming home early. She told Deshawn. And whatever happened next, they were both prepared for it. But prepared for what, exactly? That was the question Monroe couldn't answer. Not yet. The media got hold of the story by the end of the week. Local news crews camped outside Tasha's house, asking for statements, trying to get her to talk. Tasha's lawyer, a slick defense attorney named Richard Caldwell, issued a statement on her behalf. Mrs. Holloway is a victim of domestic violence who was forced to defend herself and her unborn child. She is cooperating fully with the investigation and looks forward to clearing her name. Domestic violence. That was the angle they were pushing. Marcus, the secret abuser. Tasha, the battered wife. It was a narrative people wanted to believe because it made sense, because it fit the pattern, because it gave Marcus's death a reason beyond the unthinkable truth. But Dorothy Holloway wasn't buying it. She went on every news station that would have her, looked directly into the camera, and said, "My son never laid a hand on that woman, never raised his voice, never gave her a reason to fear him, and I will not let his memory be destroyed by lies." The community split down the middle. Half believed Tasha, half believed Dorothy. And in the middle of it all, Detective Monroe kept digging. 1 week after the funeral, Monroe got a call from a pawn shop owner in Decatur. "You the detective working the Holloway case?" "I am." "Well, you might want to come down here. Just had a guy come in trying to sell some tools. Electrical tools. Had Marcus Holloway's name engraved on them." Monroe was there in 15 minutes. The tools were spread out on the counter. Wire strippers, voltage testers, a drill Marcus had gotten for his birthday. And the man who'd tried to sell them? Deshawn Parker. When Monroe confronted him, Deshawn had an answer ready. "Marcus wanted me to have them. Told me before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should take care of his tools, maybe sell them, use the money to help Tasha with the baby." "He told you this when?" Few weeks back, Marcus was planning his nursery and talking about teaching his kid how to use these tools. But sure, he definitely told his best friend to sell them if he died. That makes perfect sense. Monroe crossed her arms. "Where's Marcus's truck, Deshawn?" "What?" "His truck. The one he drove every day. The one that was in the driveway the day he died. Where is it?" Deshawn shifted his weight. "I don't know. Probably impounded or... It's registered in your name as of 4 days ago. Want to explain that?" Silence. "Let me guess," Monroe continued. "Marcus wanted you to have that too?" Deshawn's lawyer arrived before he could answer. But the damage was done. Because now Monroe had a pattern. Deshawn wasn't just grieving his best friend. He was liquidating him. Selling his tools, taking his truck, moving through Marcus's life like a vulture picking at a corpse. And when Monroe pulled financial records, she found something even more damning. 3 days before Marcus died, Tasha Holloway transferred $8,000 to Deshawn Parker's account. The memo line read, "Loan. $8,000. Transferred to the man she was sleeping with." 3 days before her husband ended up dead. Monroe sat in the interrogation room across from Tasha and her lawyer and laid out the evidence piece by piece. The text message. The money transfer. The lack of Marcus's fingerprints on the gun. The gunshot residue. The way Deshawn was systematically taking everything Marcus owned. "So here's what I think happened," Monroe said, her voice calm, clinical. "I think you and Deshawn were having an affair. I think Marcus found out. And I think instead of dealing with a messy divorce, instead of losing half of everything, you decided it would be easier if Marcus just wasn't around anymore. Am I close?" Tasha's face was a mask. "I love my husband." "Did you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you loved his life insurance more. $150,000, right? That's what Marcus was worth dead. What was he worth alive?" Caldwell, Tasha's lawyer, put a hand on her arm. "Don't answer that." "I don't have to answer that," Tasha said, her voice shaking with something that might have been fear or might have been rage. "I shot Marcus because he was going to kill me. That's the truth. And you can twist the evidence however you want, but that doesn't change what happened. Monroe leaned forward. Then why did you tell Deshawn he'd be home early? Why did you give him $8,000? Why is he selling Marcus's belongings and driving his truck? Innocent people don't act like that, Tasha. Guilty people do. But without a confession, without concrete proof of premeditation, Monroe's hands were tied. Everything she had was circumstantial. Suspicious, yes. Damning, absolutely. But not enough for a murder conviction. Not yet. 3 weeks after Marcus's death, on a muggy September evening, Tasha Holloway went into premature labor. The baby came fast and hard, 2 months early, weighing just over 4 pounds. A boy. Tiny, fragile, but alive. The nurses cleaned him up, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Tasha's arms. She looked down at this child she'd claimed was Marcus's, this child she'd used as a shield and an excuse, and started to cry. Whether those tears were from joy or guilt, nobody could say. But here's what nobody expected. Dorothy Holloway, Marcus's mother, had been planning for this moment. She'd hired her own lawyer, filed a petition with the court to have a DNA test performed on the child. If that baby is my son's, she told anyone who would listen, then he's my grandson, and I have a right to know. And if he's not, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. The DNA test was performed 2 days after the baby was born. Standard procedure in cases involving potential inheritance, potential custody battles, potential fraud. A simple cheek swab. A few days of waiting. And then the truth. Marcus Holloway was not the father. The baby belonged to Deshawn Parker. When Monroe got the call with the results, she had to sit down. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The affair wasn't just about lust or loneliness. It was about a pregnancy. A baby. A future that didn't include Marcus. Tasha wasn't carrying Marcus's child. She was carrying Deshawn's. And that meant divorce. Custody battles. Questions about paternity. Scandal. Shame. The loss of everything they'd built. Unless Marcus wasn't around to ask those questions. Motive. Clear, undeniable motive. Monroe immediately filed for arrest warrants. Tasha Holloway and Deshawn Parker. Conspiracy to commit murder. The case was tight now, the pieces falling into place. The affair, the pregnancy, the money transfer, the text message, the staged self-defense. It was premeditated. Calculated. Cold-blooded. But when the officers showed up to arrest Deshawn, his apartment was empty. Not just empty. Cleared out. Every piece of furniture gone, every personal item removed, walls bare, closets hollow. It looked like nobody had lived there in months. The doorman said Deshawn had moved out 3 days ago, paid off his lease in cash, didn't leave a forwarding address. His phone was disconnected. His bank accounts emptied. His social media deleted. Deshawn Parker had vanished. Monroe stood in that empty apartment and felt the case slipping through her fingers. Because without Deshawn, without a co-conspirator to flip, to pressure, to break, all she had was Tasha. And Tasha's story, that she was a victim, that Deshawn manipulated her, which she didn't know he was planning to run, was just plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. Tasha was arrested anyway, booked on charges of voluntary manslaughter and conspiracy. Her bail was set at $200,000. She posted it the next day. And when the news cameras caught her leaving the jail, baby in her arms, she looked directly into the lens and said, "I didn't kill my husband. Deshawn did. He used me, lied to me, and left me to take the fall. I'm as much a victim as Marcus." The media ate it up. The public ate it up. Because it was easier to believe that Tasha was a pawn than a predator. Easier to think she'd been seduced and abandoned than to accept she'd been complicit in murder. But Monroe knew better. She spent the next 2 months chasing leads, following tips, running down every possible trace of Deshawn Parker. Nothing. He'd disappeared like smoke, leaving no trail, no breadcrumbs, no mistakes. It was professional. Planned. Like he'd been preparing to run long before Marcus died. The case went cold. The prosecutor's office debated whether they had enough to convict Tasha without Deshawn's testimony. The defense argued that Tasha was a victim of coercive control, that Deshawn had orchestrated everything, that she'd been afraid for her life. And without Deshawn to contradict that story, without physical evidence proving Tasha pulled the trigger with malicious intent, the case was shaky at best. Marcus's mother was devastated. She'd lost her son. She'd lost her grandson, because the baby, legally, wasn't Marcus's, which meant Dorothy had no claim to him. And now she was losing justice too. "They're going to let her walk," she told Monroe one afternoon, sitting in the detective's office, her voice hollow. "She killed my boy, and they're going to let her walk." Monroe didn't have an answer. Because Dorothy was probably right. The case stalled. Winter came. The media moved on to other tragedies, other scandals. Tasha stayed out of the public eye, living in her house, raising the baby, waiting for her trial date. And Deshawn? Deshawn was a ghost. Until he wasn't. February. 6 months after Marcus's death. A tourist from Atlanta was vacationing in Miami, walking along South Beach, when she saw something that made her stop cold. A man sitting at an outdoor cafe, laughing with a woman, drinking something bright and tropical. He had a nice watch. Nice clothes. Nice car parked at the curb. A black Chevy Silverado with Georgia plates. The tourist pulled out her phone, pretended to take a selfie, but angled the camera to capture the man's face. Then she went back to her hotel, pulled up the news stories she'd been following about the Marcus Holloway case, and compared the photos. It was him, Deshawn Parker, living in Miami under a new name, driving Marcus's truck, wearing Marcus's gold chain. The chain that was supposed to be buried with him. When Monroe got the tip, got the photos, got the license plate number, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Because Deshawn had made a mistake. One single, arrogant, unforgivable mistake. He'd kept a trophy. Marcus's chain. The chain Tasha had removed from his body before the funeral. The chain that nobody thought to question because everyone assumed it had been buried with him. But Tasha had kept it. And then she'd sent it to Deshawn. Proof of their victory. Proof that they'd gotten away with it. Except they hadn't. Monroe contacted Miami PD, sent them everything she had, and within 48 hours, Deshawn Parker, or Sean Parker, as he was calling himself now, was in custody. And when they searched his apartment, they found more than just Marcus's chain. They found text messages. Saved. Backed up. Messages between Deshawn and Tasha planning Marcus's death. Discussing timing, discussing how to make it look like self-defense, discussing what they'd do with the insurance money. Deshawn had kept receipts. Every single one. Maybe as insurance, maybe as blackmail. Either way, it was the smoking gun Monroe needed. Within a week, both Tasha and Deshawn were charged with first-degree murder. Premeditated. Conspiracy. Fraud. The works. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. When Deshawn's lawyer offered him a plea deal, testify against Tasha, full cooperation, and they'd take the death penalty off the table, Deshawn refused. Said he'd rather go to trial. Said he'd rather take his chances with a jury. Why? Because he'd discovered something. Something that changed everything. Tasha had been recording their conversations. Every phone call, every planning session, every incriminating word. She'd been building her own insurance policy, her own way out. And when Deshawn found out, when he realized that Tasha had been planning to betray him from the start, that she'd always intended to paint him as the mastermind while she played the victim, he made a decision. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. The trial was set for late spring. Both defendants facing life without parole. Both pointing fingers at each other. Both claiming they were manipulated, used, victimized by the other. And somewhere in the middle of their lies and their blame and their desperate attempts to save themselves, the truth about Marcus Holloway's murder would finally come to light. But the question remains, was justice even possible at this point? Marcus was still dead. His mother was still grieving. His child, a child he'd never meet, a child that wasn't even his, was being raised by the woman who killed him. And the man he'd called brother, the man he'd trusted with his life, had spent the last 6 months living off his death like a parasite. Some betrayals run so deep, they can't be undone. Some wounds can't be healed. Some stories don't have happy endings. This is one of them. So here's what I need to know. Do you think Tasha and Deshaun both deserve the same punishment, or was one of them more guilty than the other? Do you think Tasha was a victim of manipulation, or was she the mastermind all along? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is far from over. And if you want to see how this trial plays out, if you want to know what happens when these two finally face a jury, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. We're going into the most interesting part of this story, and trust me, the courtroom revelations are going to blow your mind. Like this video if you're as angry as I am about what happened to Marcus. Share it if you think this story needs to be told. And turn on notifications, because True Crime Dossier is just getting started. Justice for Marcus Holloway isn't just a hashtag. It's a mission. And we're not stopping until the full truth comes out. The thing about murder is that it leaves a residue. Not just on your hands, though there's that too, but in the air, in the silence between your words, in the way you hold your body when you're trying to convince someone that you're innocent. Tasha Holloway had residue all over her. Literally. When the first responders arrived at her home that Friday evening, she was painted in her husband's blood, shaking so violently they thought she might be going into shock. But Detective Lisa Monroe would later say it wasn't shock she saw in Tasha's eyes that night. It was calculation. The kind of cold, sharp awareness that comes from someone who knows exactly what they've done and is already 3 steps ahead, building the narrative that will save them. But here's the problem with lies, no matter how well rehearsed. Forensic evidence doesn't care about your story. And Tasha's story? It was about to fall apart, piece by bloody piece. 4:27 p.m. The 911 dispatch center receives a call that will redirect the course of this entire investigation. A female voice, breathless and frantic. "My husband, he came at us. I had to, oh God, there's so much blood." The dispatcher tries to get details, tries to keep her calm, but Tasha's words tumble out in a chaotic stream that sounds almost too perfect in its panic. "He found out about the affair and he lost his mind. He was going to kill us. I grabbed the gun. I didn't mean to. I had to protect my baby." Protect her baby. That phrase would be repeated a dozen times in the first hour alone. To the 911 operator. To the paramedics. To the first officers on scene. To anyone who would listen. As if repetition could make it true. As if saying it enough times would erase the inconsistencies already forming like cracks in a windshield. By the time Detective Lisa Monroe arrived at 4:53 p.m., the scene had been secured, the body photographed, and Tasha Holloway had been given a blanket and a bottle of water while she sat on the front porch, still trembling, still crying. Monroe took one look at her and felt that familiar tug in her gut. The one that told her something here didn't line up. 15 years of homicide investigations had given Monroe a sixth sense for performance. And this felt rehearsed. Marcus Holloway's body lay exactly where he'd fallen, face down on the living room floor, arms slightly spread as if he'd been reaching forward when the bullet hit. The entry wound was clean, centered perfectly in his chest. One shot. No hesitation. No warning shots. No spray of wild bullets from someone in fear for their life. Just one clean, calculated shot that dropped him where he stood. Monroe crouched next to the body, studied the blood pattern, the position of his hands, the expression frozen on his face. Not rage. Not violence. Surprise. Marcus Holloway looked like a man who'd been caught off guard by his own death. The gun was on the coffee table. A 9mm Glock, safety off, 1 round fired. Monroe pulled on gloves, carefully bagged it for evidence. Then she walked through the rest of the house, taking in details that the responding officers had missed. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No broken glass or damaged walls. The bedroom upstairs showed signs of hasty dressing. Clothes on the floor, sheets tangled, but nothing violent. This wasn't the scene of a man who'd come home in a murderous rage. This was the scene of something else entirely. Deshaun Parker was in the kitchen when Monroe found him. smoking a cigarette with hands that couldn't stay still. He looked up when she entered, and Monroe saw it immediately: guilt. Not the guilt of someone who'd just watched his best friend die. The guilt of someone who knew more than he was saying. "Walk me through what happened," Monroe said, her voice neutral, professional. Deshawn took a long drag, exhaled slowly. "Marcus came home early. Caught us together. Went ballistic. Left, then came back maybe 20-30 minutes later with a gun. Started threatening us, saying we'd pay for what we did. Tasha tried to calm him down, but he wasn't hearing it. He raised the gun, pointed it at me. Tasha grabbed it. They struggled. It went off. He met Monroe's eyes. She saved my life. Simple. Clean. The kind of story that would hold up in court if you didn't look too closely. But Monroe always looked closely. Where'd the gun come from? What? The gun. Was it Marcus's? Did he bring it with him? Deshawn hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but Monroe caught it. Must have been his. I don't know where else it would have come from. You and Tasha don't own any firearms? No. Monroe nodded slowly. So Marcus, who by all accounts never owned a gun, never talked about guns, never showed any interest in guns, somehow acquired one in the 30 minutes between leaving this house and coming back. Deshawn's jaw tightened. I guess when you're mad enough, you find a way. But that didn't sit right. None of it did. Monroe thanked him, stepped outside, and immediately called for a full forensic workup. Because if this was self-defense, there would be evidence. Defensive wounds. Gunshot residue on Marcus's hands. His fingerprints on the weapon. Blood spatter patterns consistent with a struggle. And if those things weren't there, then they were looking at something much darker. The neighborhood was already gathering. Word travels fast in communities like this, where everyone knows everyone's business. By nightfall, Maple Grove Avenue was lined with people standing in clusters, whispering, speculating, grieving. Some were crying for Marcus. Others were already defending Tasha. She had no choice, Monroe heard one woman say. What else was she supposed to do? But there were other voices too, quieter, more skeptical. I saw them together last week, an elderly man told his neighbor. Tasha and Deshawn. In her car. The way they were looking at each other. That ain't friendship. The community was splitting before Monroe's eyes. And in the middle of it all stood Dorothy Holloway, Marcus's mother, standing on her son's front lawn with her arms crossed and her face carved from stone. When Monroe approached her, Dorothy didn't cry. Didn't fall apart. She just looked at the detective with eyes that had seen too much loss already and said, My son didn't do this. Whatever they're saying, it's a lie. Marcus would never hurt anyone. Especially not her. Especially not with a baby coming. Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we have to follow the evidence. Then follow it, Dorothy interrupted. Follow it all the way to the truth. Because that girl in there, she pointed toward the house. She's lying. I can feel it in my bones. And that man, Deshawn. She shook her head. I watched him grow up. Treated him like my own son. And now my real son is dead. And they expect me to believe he's the villain in this story? No. Something's wrong. And I need you to find out what. Monroe promised she would. And she meant it. The funeral was held 5 days later at Greater Faith Baptist Church. The same church where Marcus and Tasha had been married 4 years earlier. The same church where Marcus had served as a deacon, where he'd helped with youth programs and volunteered for community outreach. Now his casket sat at the front of the sanctuary, closed because Dorothy couldn't bear to see her son's face in death. And the church was packed with people trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. Tasha sat in the front row, dressed in black, her pregnant belly visible even through the loose dress she wore. She cried throughout the service, dabbed at her eyes with tissue, leaned on her sister for support. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman shattered by grief and guilt. But Monroe, sitting 3 rows back, watched the way Tasha's eyes kept darting around the room, the way her hands kept fidgeting with her phone, the way she seemed more anxious than sad. This wasn't a widow mourning her husband. This was someone worried about getting caught. And then there was Deshawn. He arrived late, slipped into the back of the church wearing dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. He didn't sit, didn't participate in the hymns or the prayers. Just stood against the back wall like he was waiting for permission to leave. Several men in the congregation noticed him, and Monroe saw the way they stared, the way their faces hardened. Jerome, Marcus's cousin, actually got up and walked to the back, got right in Deshawn's face, and said loud enough for half the church to hear, "You shouldn't be here." Deshawn didn't respond, didn't remove his sunglasses, just turned and walked out. But not before Monroe noticed what he was wearing, Marcus's watch. The silver Movado that Marcus never took off. The watch that should have been on his wrist in that casket. After the service, Monroe pulled Dorothy aside. The watch Deshawn was wearing. That was Marcus's. Dorothy's face went hard. Yes, Marcus loved that watch. Saved for months to buy it. Why would Deshawn have it? That's what I intend to find out. The forensics report came back 3 days after the funeral, and it confirmed every suspicion Monroe had been harboring. The gun that killed Marcus Holloway had only one set of fingerprints on it, Tasha's. Not Marcus's. Not Deshawn's. Just Tasha's, clear and unmistakable on the grip, the trigger, the barrel. Which meant Marcus had never touched that weapon. Had never held it, never pointed it, never threatened anyone with it. The entire foundation of Tasha's self-defense claim, that Marcus had come at them armed, was a lie. But it got worse. The gunshot residue analysis showed that Tasha had fired a weapon, which was expected. Deshawn tested negative for GSR, also expected since he claimed he hadn't fired the gun. But Marcus? Marcus also tested negative. No gunshot residue on his hands, his clothes, his skin. Which meant he hadn't fired a weapon. Hadn't been anywhere near a discharged firearm before he died. If there had been a struggle for the gun, if Marcus had been grabbing for it when it went off, there would be residue. There would be evidence of contact. There was none. Monroe sat in her office staring at these reports and feeling the case shift beneath her feet. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't even a crime of passion. This was starting to look like murder. Premeditated, calculated murder. She pulled Tasha's phone records next, scrolling through weeks of calls and texts. Most of it was mundane. Conversations with friends, texts to her sister about baby names and nursery colors. But then Monroe found something that stopped her cold. A text message sent from Tasha to Deshawn at 1:47 p.m. on the day Marcus died. 2 hours before he came home. 2 hours before he was shot. For simple words that changed everything. He'll be home early. Monroe read it 3 times, feeling the implications settle like ice in her chest. Tasha knew Marcus was coming home early. She'd texted Deshawn to warn him, which meant they'd been expecting Marcus. They'd been preparing for him. And 3 minutes later, Deshawn had responded, "Be ready." Be ready for what? Be ready for confrontation? Be ready for violence? Be ready for murder? Monroe immediately got a warrant for Deshawn's phone, his financial records, his apartment. She brought him in for questioning, sat him down in an interrogation room, and laid the text messages on the table between them. "Explain these." Deshawn barely glanced at them. "Explain what?" "We were texting. That's not a crime. You told someone to be ready 2 hours before your best friend ended up dead. What were you telling Tasha to be ready for, Deshawn?" "I don't remember. It was just a text. Just a text that establishes foreknowledge. That proves you and Tasha knew Marcus was coming home early, that you were expecting him, that you were preparing for something. So I'll ask again, what were you getting ready for?" Deshawn leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "I want a lawyer." And that was the end of the interview. But it was also the beginning of the unraveling. Because now Monroe had probable cause. Now she had evidence of conspiracy. Now she could start pulling at the threads and see what else came loose. What came loose was damning. Financial records showed that 3 days before Marcus's death, Tasha had transferred $8,000 to Deshawn's account. The transaction was labeled personal loan, but Monroe didn't buy it. $8,000 transferred to the man she was sleeping with days before her husband died? That wasn't a loan. That was a payment. But for what? Monroe couldn't prove it yet, but the pieces were starting to form a picture she couldn't ignore. Then there was Deshawn's behavior after the funeral. Monroe had officers keeping loose surveillance on both suspects, and what they reported back was troubling. Deshawn had been seen at Tasha's house multiple times, despite both of them being under investigation. He'd been spotted driving Marcus's truck, the black Silverado that Marcus had bought 2 years ago and babied like it was his child. And when Monroe checked the DMV records, she found that the truck had been transferred into Deshawn's name 4 days after the funeral. The title signed over by Tasha as Marcus's beneficiary. Monroe drove to a pawn shop in Decatur after getting a tip from the owner, a man named Carl who'd called the police station asking about the Holloway case. "I think you need to see this," Carl said when Monroe arrived. Spread out on his counter were tools. Electrical tools. Wire strippers, voltage testers, drill bits, a multimeter. Each one had Marcus Holloway's name engraved on it. "Guy came in trying to sell these yesterday," Carl explained. "Soon as I saw the name, I told him I needed to verify ownership. He got nervous and left. But I got his ID before he walked out." Carl slid a photocopy across the counter. Deshawn Parker. Monroe felt her anger rising. Deshawn wasn't just moving on with his life. He was liquidating Marcus's, taking everything the man had owned, everything he'd worked for, and selling it like it meant nothing. Like Marcus himself had meant nothing. She brought Deshawn in again, confronted him with the evidence. "Marcus wanted me to have his stuff," Deshawn said, his voice flat. "We talked about it before he died. He said if anything ever happened to him, I should take care of Tasha, help her out, maybe sell some things to give her money for the baby. You expect me to believe that Marcus, who was planning his child's future, who was buying nursery furniture and painting rooms, told you to sell his tools and take his truck if he died? Believe what you want." "I believe you're a liar," Monroe said, her voice hard. "I believe you and Tasha planned this. I believe you killed Marcus for his insurance money, for his house, for his life. And I believe when I'm done investigating, I'm going to prove it." Deshawn smiled then. Actually smiled. "Prove whatever you want, detective. But without evidence, all you've got is a grieving friend helping out his best friend's widow." He was right. And that's what made Monroe's blood boil. She had suspicions, circumstantial evidence, red flags everywhere she looked. But without a confession, without concrete proof of premeditation, without someone willing to testify about a conspiracy, she couldn't make the case stick. Not yet. Then came the phone call that changed everything. 3 weeks after Marcus's death, at 2 a.m, Monroe's cell phone rang. It was Atlanta Medical Center. Tasha Holloway had been admitted in premature labor. The baby was coming. Monroe arrived at the hospital as the sun was rising, found Tasha in recovery, exhausted and pale, with a tiny infant in an incubator beside her. For pounds, 6 ounces. 2 months premature but stable. A boy. Tasha had named him Marcus Jr., which Monroe found both touching and grotesque in equal measure. But the name didn't matter. What mattered was the DNA test. Dorothy Holloway had been planning this moment since the day her son died. She'd hired her own attorney, filed a petition with the court demanding a paternity test. "If that child is my grandson," she'd told Monroe, "I have a right to know. And if he's not," the rest went unsaid. Because if the baby wasn't Marcus's, then Tasha had another motive for murder. A motive that went beyond money, beyond convenience, beyond anything they'd considered so far. The test was performed 48 hours after the birth. A simple cheek swab from the baby, compared against DNA samples taken from Marcus during the autopsy. Monroe waited for the results with a feeling of dread and anticipation she couldn't quite name. Part of her hoped the baby was Marcus's, that at least one piece of his legacy would survive. But another part of her knew in the way you know things when all the evidence is pointing in one terrible direction, that the results would blow this case wide open. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Monroe was at her desk, going through witness statements for the 100th time, when her phone rang. The DNA lab. She answered, already knowing what they were going to say. Detective Monroe? We have the results from the Holloway paternity test. Marcus Holloway is excluded as the biological father. Probability of paternity, 0%. Monroe closed her eyes. Do we have comparison samples from Deshaun Parker? We do. Cross-referenced from his booking after a 2016 DUI. Deshaun Parker cannot be excluded as the biological father. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. There it was. The motive. Clear and undeniable. Tasha hadn't been carrying Marcus's child. She'd been carrying Deshaun's. Which meant when Marcus found them together, when he discovered the affair, he would have eventually discovered the pregnancy wasn't his. And that would have meant divorce, asset division, custody battles, public humiliation, the destruction of the perfect life Tasha had built. Unless Marcus wasn't around to discover the truth. Monroe called the prosecutor's office immediately. I've got motive. I've got opportunity. I've got evidence of conspiracy. I need arrest warrants for Tasha Holloway and Deshaun Parker, charges of first-degree murder. The warrants were issued within 24 hours. Monroe personally drove to Tasha's house to make the arrest, taking 2 uniformed officers with her. She knocked on the door, prepared for tears, for protests, for Tasha to play the victim one more time. Tasha answered the door with the baby in her arms, saw the officers, and went pale. What's this about? Tasha Holloway, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Holloway. You have the right to remain silent. Murder? I told you it was self-defense. I was protecting myself. The baby isn't Marcus's, Monroe said quietly. It's Deshaun's, which gives you motive to want Marcus dead before he found out. Before he asked questions. Before your perfect life fell apart. She gestured for Tasha to hand the baby to her sister, who'd appeared behind her. You conspired with Deshaun Parker to murder your husband, and I'm going to prove it. Tasha was booked, photographed, fingerprinted. Bail was set at $200,000. She posted it the next day, walked out of jail with her lawyer at her side, and immediately went on the offensive. I'm innocent, she told the news cameras gathered outside. Deshaun manipulated me. He's the father of my child, yes, but I didn't know he was planning to hurt Marcus. I'm a victim too. Monroe watched the press conference from her office and felt a new kind of anger settle in her chest. Because Tasha was good. She was believable. She had the tears, the trembling voice, the story of a woman seduced and abandoned by a manipulative man. And juries loved that narrative. The poor pregnant woman who'd been used. It might actually work. Unless they could find Deshaun and get him to flip. Monroe sent officers to Deshaun's apartment with the arrest warrant. They knocked. No answer. They got the building manager to open the door. The apartment was empty. Not just empty like someone had moved out. Empty like someone had erased themselves from existence. No furniture. No clothes. No personal items. The walls were bare. The closets hollow. Even the kitchen cabinets had been cleared out. It looked like nobody had lived there in months. Monroe walked through the space, feeling the case slipping through her fingers. She checked with the building manager, who said Deshaun had paid off his lease 3 days ago. Cash. Didn't leave a forwarding address. Didn't say where he was going. Just packed up and vanished. His phone was disconnected. His bank accounts emptied. His social media deleted. Every trace of Deshaun Parker had been systematically erased. Monroe stood in that empty apartment and knew they'd lost him. Without Deshaun, without his testimony, without a co-conspirator to pressure and flip, all they had was Tasha. And Tasha's story, that she was a victim, that Deshaun manipulated her, that she didn't know he was planning to run, was just plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. The case stalled. The prosecutor's office debated whether they could convict Tasha without Deshaun. Defense attorneys argued coercive control, argued that Tasha had been afraid of Deshaun, that she'd acted under duress. And without Deshaun to contradict that story, without physical evidence proving Tasha pulled the trigger with intent to kill, the case was shaky. Marcus's mother was devastated. Monroe met with her weekly, tried to keep her updated, tried to give her hope. But Dorothy knew. She could read it in Monroe's face. "They're going to let her walk," Dorothy said one afternoon, her voice hollow. "My son is dead, and the woman who killed him is going to walk free." Monroe wanted to promise her justice. Wanted to swear that she'd never give up, that she'd find Deshawn, that she'd make both of them pay. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, without Deshawn, they might not have a case. And Deshawn was gone. Winter came. The media moved on. The case went cold. Tasha stayed out of jail, raising the baby, waiting for her trial date that kept getting pushed back as the prosecution struggled to build a case without their key witness. And Deshawn? Deshawn was a ghost. Until he made one fatal mistake. 6 months after Marcus's death, Monroe got a call from an Atlanta resident vacationing in Miami. "I think I saw Deshawn Parker. I'm not completely sure, but the guy looked just like him, and he was wearing something, a gold chain, that looked familiar. I took a picture. I'm sending it to you now." Monroe opened the image on her phone and felt her heart skip. It was Deshawn, sitting at a beachside cafe, laughing, drink in hand, wearing nice clothes, driving a black truck that looked an awful lot like Marcus's Silverado. And around his neck, catching the Miami sun, was Marcus's gold chain. The thick, distinctive chain that Marcus had worn every day. The chain that was supposed to have been buried with him. But it wasn't, because Tasha had removed it before the funeral. And she'd sent it to Deshawn. A trophy. Proof that they'd won. Except they hadn't. Because that chain was about to become evidence. And Deshawn's arrogance, his need to keep a piece of Marcus, to wear his victory around his neck, was about to be his undoing. Monroe contacted Miami PD, sent them everything. Within 48 hours, Deshawn Parker, now calling himself Sean Parker, was in custody. And when they searched his apartment, they found text messages. Saved. Backed up. Messages between him and Tasha planning the murder. Discussing timing. Discussing how to stage it. Discussing what they'd do with the insurance money. Deshawn had kept receipts. Every single one. And now, finally, Monroe had her smoking gun. Both Tasha and Deshawn were rearrested, charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud. The trial was set. The evidence compiled. And the truth, the ugly, brutal truth about what had really happened to Marcus Holloway, was finally going to come out. But even knowing that justice was coming, even knowing that both of them would face a jury, Monroe couldn't shake one question. Could anything they did to Tasha and Deshawn ever equal what they'd taken from Marcus? Could any prison sentence restore a life? Could any verdict bring back a good man who'd been betrayed by the two people he trusted most? The answer, of course, was no. Justice isn't restoration. It's just accountability. And sometimes that has to be enough. So here's what I need from you right now. Do you think Tasha and Deshawn both deserve the same punishment, and was one more guilty than the other? Was Tasha a mastermind or a manipulated woman? Drop your answer in the comments, because I want to know what you think. And if you want to see how this trial ends, if you want to know what a jury decides when they hear the full story, you need to subscribe to True Crime Dossier right now. Hit that subscribe button. Smash the like button if this story has you as furious as it has me, and turn on notifications because what happened next will shock you, and the courtroom revelations are going to shake you. Justice for Marcus Holloway isn't just a case number. It's a mission, and we're seeing it through to the end. Here's a question that's going to haunt you long after this story ends. Can you ever truly know the person sleeping next to you? Can you ever really understand what someone is capable of when their back is against the wall and their future depends on your silence? Marcus Holloway thought he knew. He trusted his wife with his life, his best friend with his secrets, and his future with their hands. And that trust killed him. But here's what Marcus couldn't have known, what he couldn't have seen coming even in his darkest moments of suspicion. The people who betrayed him were also betraying each other. Because when you build a partnership on murder, when your foundation is deception and blood, eventually that structure collapses. And when it did, when Tasha and Deshawn's carefully constructed lies finally crumbled, the truth that emerged was uglier than anyone imagined. This is where justice finally catches up to the guilty. But the question remains, After everything that's been taken, after all the lies and all the death, is justice even enough? 6 months had passed since Marcus Holloway's murder. 6 months of Detective Lisa Monroe chasing ghosts, following dead-end leads, watching Tasha Holloway walk free on bail while her co-conspirator had vanished into thin air. The case had gone cold in the way cases do when the primary suspect disappears and the evidence, while damning, isn't quite enough to guarantee conviction. The prosecutor's office was nervous. Tasha's defense team was confident. And Marcus's mother, Dorothy, was losing hope that she'd ever see justice for her son. But then came February. Specifically, February 14th. Valentine's Day. A day about love and romance, and the people we choose to trust with our hearts. How fitting that this would be the day Deshaun Parker's arrogance finally caught up with him. A woman named Janet Moore was on vacation in Miami, taking a break from the Atlanta cold, enjoying the beach and the sunshine and the kind of anonymous freedom that comes with being somewhere nobody knows your name. She was sitting at an outdoor cafe on Ocean Drive, sipping a mojito and people watching, when she saw him. A man at the bar, laughing loud, dressed in designer clothes that looked expensive even from a distance, talking to a woman who clearly wasn't from around here either. There was something familiar about his face, something that made Janet pull out her phone and pretend to take a selfie while actually angling the camera toward him. She got a clear shot. His face in profile, the gold chain around his neck catching the Miami sun, and behind him, parked at the curb, a black Chevy Silverado with Georgia plates. Janet had been following the Marcus Holloway case like half of Atlanta had, reading every update, watching every news segment. She knew that face. She knew that truck. And when she zoomed in on the photo and saw the chain, thick, distinctive, the kind of chain you don't forget, she knew she had to call someone. She called Detective Monroe directly, got her number from a news article about the case. I think I just saw Deshaun Parker in Miami. I'm sending you a photo right now. Monroe was in her car within minutes, the photo already open on her phone. It was him. No question. Deshaun Parker, living under the sun like he hadn't just helped murder his best friend, like he hadn't abandoned his newborn child, like he was free and clear and untouchable. But it was the chain that made Monroe's blood run cold. Marcus's chain. The one that was supposed to be buried with him. The one that should have been 6 feet under in a casket at Greenwood Cemetery. Except it wasn't. Someone had removed it. And Monroe knew exactly who. She pulled the funeral home records, made some calls, leaned on people until she got answers. The night before Marcus's burial, Tasha Holloway had visited the funeral home alone. She'd told the staff she wanted a private moment to say goodbye, needed to see her husband one last time before they closed the casket forever. They'd let her in, given her space, respected her grief. And when she left, she took Marcus's chain, his watch, his wedding ring. Claimed she wanted to keep them for sentimental reasons, for the baby to have when he got older. The funeral director had noted it in the file but thought nothing of it. Grieving widows did things like that all the time. But Tasha hadn't kept those items for sentiment. She'd kept them as trophies. And she'd mailed Marcus's chain to Deshaun in Miami. Proof that they'd won. Proof that Marcus was gone and they were free. Except they weren't free. They were just running. And now, finally, the running was over. Monroe contacted Miami PD, coordinated with detectives down there, and sent them everything she had. Within 48 hours, they had Deshaun under surveillance. Confirmed his new identity, Sean Parker, nice and simple, easy to remember. Confirmed his address, his routine, his arrogance. Because Deshaun wasn't hiding. He was living. Living well. Living off Marcus's death like it was a lottery he'd won. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Deshaun was leaving his apartment, keys in hand, Marcus's chain around his neck, when 6 officers surrounded him. He didn't run. Didn't fight. Just put his hands up and smiled, that same cold smile Monroe had seen in Atlanta. The smile of a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. Deshaun Parker, you're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Holloway. I don't know who that is, Deshaun said calmly. My name is Sean Parker. Yeah, we know about that too. Identity fraud, We'll add that to the list. They brought him back to Atlanta in handcuffs, and Monroe was waiting when he arrived. She let him sit in the interrogation room for 3 hours, let him stew, let the reality of his situation sink in. Then she walked in, sat down across from him, and laid out every piece of evidence she had. The text messages, the money transfers, the phone records, the DNA test proving the baby was his. And finally, the chain. Marcus's chain, recovered from Deshawn's apartment in Miami, complete with Marcus's initials engraved on the back. How did you get that? Monroe asked, her voice quiet, dangerous. Deshawn didn't answer. Let me tell you how. Tasha took it from Marcus's body before the funeral. Mailed it to you in Miami. A trophy. Proof that you'd gotten away with murder. Except you didn't get away with it, did you? Because that chain just became evidence of conspiracy, of premeditation, of the cold-blooded murder of a man who thought you were his brother. And that's when Deshawn's composure finally cracked. Not because of the evidence. Not because he knew he was caught. But because of something Monroe said next. Something she'd discovered in the last 72 hours while Deshawn was being extradited. Tasha's been recording you, Deshawn. Every phone call, every conversation you two had planning Marcus's death. She kept them all. And when she realized we were closing in, when she knew she was going down, she made a deal. She's testifying against you in exchange for a reduced sentence. She played you. The whole time, she was building her exit strategy. And you were just a tool she was always planning to throw away. The look on Deshawn's face in that moment was something Monroe would remember for the rest of her career. Not fear. Not even anger. Just the slow, dawning realization that he'd been betrayed by the same woman he'd helped commit murder. That Tasha had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. That while he thought they were partners, she'd been preparing to destroy him. That's a lie, Deshawn said, but his voice had lost its edge. Is it? Let me play you something. Monroe pulled out her phone, pressed play. Tasha's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. We have to make it look like self-defense, Deshawn. I'll say Marcus came at us with a gun. You'll back me up. Simple. And then Deshawn's voice responding. What if people don't believe it? And Tasha again. They'll believe it because I'll make them believe it. I'm good at that. You know I am. There were hours of recordings. Conversations spanning months. Every detail of their plan captured in Tasha's careful, calculated voice. She'd been preparing for this moment since the beginning, building an insurance policy in case things went wrong. And now, with her back against the wall and her freedom on the line, she'd cashed it in. Deshawn realized it then, sitting in that interrogation room with Monroe's eyes on him, understanding that the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd killed for, the woman carrying his child, had been planning to betray him all along. And something inside him broke. Not his will, not his pride, but his loyalty. Because if Tasha was throwing him under the bus, he was taking her with him. He told Monroe everything. Every detail of the affair that had started 8 months before Marcus's death. Every conversation about how Marcus was in the way, how they couldn't be together as long as he was alive, how the baby was going to expose everything. The plan they'd crafted over weeks of whispered phone calls and secret meetings. Stage a confrontation, make it look like self-defense, play their roles perfectly. Deshawn would be the protective friend. Tasha would be the scared pregnant wife. And Marcus? Marcus would be the villain, the jealous husband driven mad by betrayal. She said we'd wait a year, maybe 2, then go public with our relationship. People would understand, she said. We'd get the insurance money, sell the house, and start fresh somewhere new. Nobody would know we'd planned it. Except you did plan it, Monroe said. You murdered him. Deshawn looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something like regret in his eyes. Not for what he'd done, but for getting caught, for trusting the wrong person. She was supposed to get rid of those recordings. She promised me she would. She lied. Just like she lied to Marcus. Just like she's lying now, telling the prosecutor that you manipulated her, that she was afraid of you, that you're the mastermind and she's just a victim. That's what she's selling. And a jury might believe it. unless you tell them the truth. Deshawn understood what Monroe was offering. A chance to take Tasha down with him. A chance to make sure that if he was going to prison, she'd be right there beside him. And he took it. Testified in detail about every conversation, every plan, every moment they'd conspired to end Marcus Holloway's life. And in exchange, the death penalty came off the table. He'd get life without parole instead of execution. It wasn't mercy. It was just math. One testimony for one life. That's all justice ever is, a transaction. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision. The affair, the pregnancy, the financial motive, the text messages, the staged self-defense, and the recordings. They played Tasha's voice describing how to manipulate the crime scene, how to coach their stories, how to cry on cue for the cameras. They showed the jury photos of Marcus's chain, recovered from Deshawn's apartment, proof that this wasn't grief or sentiment, but cold calculation. Tasha's defense tried to argue coercion, tried to paint her as a battered woman manipulated by a controlling man. But the recordings destroyed that narrative. You can't claim you were afraid of someone when you're the one orchestrating the murder. You can't play the victim when your voice is the one saying, "Make sure there are no witnesses." The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they came back, the verdict was unanimous. Deshawn Parker, guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Tasha Holloway, guilty of voluntary manslaughter and conspiracy. She'd taken the plea deal in the end, realized her recordings weren't enough to save her, and admitted to her role in exchange for a reduced sentence. Deshawn got life without the possibility of parole. Tasha got 25 years. The baby, Marcus Jr., was placed in the custody of Dorothy Holloway, who stood in that courtroom and heard the verdicts with dry eyes and a heart that would never fully heal. Because here's the truth about justice. It doesn't bring people back. It doesn't erase the pain or fill the void or make the world right again. It just holds people accountable. And sometimes that has to be enough. Dorothy visits Marcus's grave every Sunday after church, brings fresh flowers, sits on the bench nearby, and talks to her son like he's still there listening. She tells him about the baby, about how he's growing, about how he has Marcus's eyes and his gentle spirit. She tells him that she'll make sure the boy knows the truth. Not the ugly parts, not the betrayal and the murder, but the important parts. That his father was a good man. That Marcus Holloway worked hard, loved deeply, and trusted the wrong people. That he deserved better than what he got. And carved into Marcus's headstone, beneath his name and the dates that bookend a life cut far too short, are words that Dorothy chose herself. Betrayed by those he trusted most. Remembered by those who loved him best. Because that's Marcus's legacy now. Not the way he died, but the way he lived. Not the people who killed him, but the people who loved him. And while Tasha and Deshawn sit in separate prisons, serving their separate sentences, living with their separate guilt, Marcus rests. Finally at peace. Finally free from the people who destroyed him. But the question that started this entire story still remains, and it's one I need you to think about long after you close this video. How well do you really know the people in your life? Your partner, your best friend, and the people you'd trust with anything. Do you truly know what they're capable of when their desires conflict with your existence? Marcus Holloway thought he knew, and it cost him everything. So maybe the lesson here isn't just about betrayal. Maybe it's about vigilance, about paying attention to the signs, about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you can't prove it yet. Because the truth is, most betrayals don't happen in one moment. They happen slowly, over time, in small choices and secret conversations and lies that build on lies until the foundation of trust is so eroded that collapse is inevitable. Marcus saw the signs. The distance. The cologne. The phone calls. He just didn't want to believe what they meant. And by the time he did, it was too late. So here's what I need from you right now. If this story made you feel something, if it made you angry or sad or grateful for the people in your life who would never do this, I need you to hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about Tasha and Deshawn's sentences. Were they fair? Should they have gotten more time? Less? Do you think justice was truly served? And if you're not already subscribed to True Crime Dossier, what are you waiting for? We're telling the stories that matter, the stories about real people and real betrayals and real consequences. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join this community of people who believe that the victims deserve to be remembered and the guilty deserve to be held accountable. Marcus Holloway's story doesn't end with his death. It ends with us, keeping his memory alive, making sure that Tasha and Deshawn's names are forever attached to the word murderer, and reminding the world that some betrayals can never be forgiven. Justice for Marcus isn't just a verdict. It's a promise, and we're keeping it. See you in the next one.